In this edition of Grace Excel's Bible Study, I want to cover John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, which is the fourth section of this particular study. I want to go back and consider, however, where things have been in John chapter 1 after the overture in the first 18 verses. There were four separate events or four separate accounts or descriptions of what took place beginning in verse 19 with the ministry of John the Baptist. We don't know that it was called day one. It doesn't say that. The story just unfolds beginning in verse 19. Following, there are three next day accounts. The phrase next day is mentioned by John the Apostle beginning in verse 29, a second one in verse 35, and the last one in verse 43. If we then consider that prior to the next day was a day, beginning in verse 19, then from John chapter 1, 19 through 51, there are 4 days in John's narrative, the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, which is the heralding of John the Baptist and the questions that the Jewish leaders ask of him. As the previous video detailed, there were 7 questions they ask of him. Then the subsequent 3 days is John's recognition of Jesus by the sign of the Spirit's authentication, which is the dove. He's referred to as the Lamb of God. He's referred to as a man. He's referred to as the Son of God. Day 3, John the Baptist's disciples, Andrew being one of them. There are actually 2 disciples mentioned, but only Andrew is named. We don't know who the other one is. But these disciples leave to follow Jesus. I'm going to go ahead, as I've promised I would do in the study, edit this document in real time. I do it in one take, which means that I'm going to make mistakes, and hopefully I'll correct that. And please feel free to leave comments, and I'll make it better as we go. And then finally, Jesus is named, and now it's part of the circumstance throughout the rest of this chapter 1. Finally, in chapter 1, on day 4, Jesus calls Philip and Nathanael. And in so doing, Jesus does something that is going to be a precedent in his gospel that demonstrates that of all the things the Jewish people had experienced and knew about, he is the completion of. So from Genesis and the story of Jacob and Jacob's ladder, which was a confirmation to Jacob that he was an heir to the Abrahamic promise, Jacob sees a ladder into heaven on which angels are ascending and descending. In this day 4 account from John chapter 1 verses 43 through 51, Jesus says that you will see, or the angels are ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So in one section, Jesus is referred to as the son of Joseph, he's referred to as the Son of God, and he's referred to as the Son of Man. And that's significant to consider now in the transition out of chapter 1, the way the editors have listed it, into John chapter 2. As has been my practice, and will continue to do this, I'm going to remove the title here, which is from the New American Standard Edition, in the wedding or the miracle at Cana, because it's very significant to consider the timestamps that I've highlighted. You'll note here in John chapter 2, verse 1, and I'll read these 12 verses, and then I'll come back and draw distinctions and note the significance of the dating or the timing that John the Apostle has given us. Beginning in chapter 1, verse 2, on the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." There were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the head waiter." So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom, and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there many days. It's only 12 verses, but I'd like to highlight that there are some significant markers that in the arc of the text, in the arc of the story, are pointing to something significant in light of John's telling of the story of the life of Jesus. He opens with the timing, on the 3rd day. We've seen from John chapter 1, 3 recitations of the next day. As I said earlier, it seems that in John chapter 1, verses 19 through 51, the apostle has given us a story of Jesus' earthly ministry in the count of 4 days. So a pattern is established that 4 days is then followed by a 3rd day. As I read this, and I think any reader could make sense of this, the 3rd day doesn't refer back to the 3rd day, or day 3 in John chapter 1. But it would seem to me that the 3rd day here in John 2 is the 3rd day after the 4th day. If that's the case, following the earlier points that I've made, is that John has intentionally tied his gospel to Genesis chapter 1. As John says in the beginning, Genesis says in the beginning, and particularly the overture, as I mentioned, the first 18 verses follows a 3-3-1 pattern. Genesis is 3-3-1, or 6 days of creation, followed by the Sabbath day. Then the 7th day is going to be the day of deity, the eternal day. The 7th is divine, or as this study is emphasizing, the 7th is grace. It's the excessive thing. It's the thing that excels. It goes beyond the natural or the Jewish custom. So here at this wedding at Cana, Jesus is going to turn water into wine. I have to tell you, just as a very personal aside, I've never been impressed with this miracle, or at least wasn't at the outset of my study of the scriptures, because this is a miracle that doesn't help the blind see, the lame walk, the demon-possessed become free. This is a miracle almost of pleasure or luxury. It's for people at a wedding to enjoy something that was beyond what they were accustomed to enjoying. So it satisfies a sensual or a pleasurable aspect of their life. We often would condemn that kind of thinking. But in this particular chapter, and in this story, convention is challenged. Jesus makes hundreds of gallons of water into wine. And not just any wine, as we've seen, but it's the good wine. So the context tells us there's something more going on than just simply the water into wine. But that reality seems to say there's something else here. So I'd like to consider now chapter 2, verse 1. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. I'm going to drop this down just to separate this out and to consider that we see this setting here, but I want to now note that this third day, if I'm following the timestamp dating of John, that now I need to see this miracle, and we'll see that it's the first of his miracles, the beginning of his signs. This occurs on the seventh day in the narrative. So on the third day, following the days previously discussed, that means this particular sign occurs on the seventh day. I want to note how significant the seventh day is in biblical teaching, and in particular on the Gospel of John. 7 is going to be very significant throughout. So now we see the timing, and we see who was there, and we see the occasion, the wedding. They were invited. This is a story that's a little odd to our way of thinking, at least it is to me, that we don't see the bride mentioned, and brides are usually the focal point, the centerpiece of any wedding. We do see the bridegroom referenced because the head waiter talks to him about how what he's done apparently is exceptional, although we know it's actually sourced in what Jesus did. But nevertheless, we see the timing, we see the presence of who was there, and we see the occasion, the wedding. So now we see the problem. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, this being Jesus, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour." A very significant phrase throughout the Gospel of John. It's the first time we see it here. Him referencing it, we'd seen back, if you can go back and consider that in day 3, in regards to those who left to follow Jesus, there's a reference to the 10th hour. But that's a timestamp that's a little different than when Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come." This will bear further study. So this particular sentence, verse 4, has raised a lot of concern. The question is his use of the word woman rather than mom or mother. The familial reference is missing. Is this sarcastic? Is it demeaning? None of that seems to be true. It's a matter of he is not going to reveal himself, and she appealed to him. We can assume a few things here. Have to be careful. The text doesn't tell us this, but I think it's logical to make some assumptions and to think about these. That historically, in their life together, this being the beginning of his earthly ministry, we see some likelihood that the background of Jesus' relationship to Mary is that she knew she could appeal to him, which is what she's done. Only this time he resists, at least in regards to initial response, because we will see he does do something. So what does this have to do with us, the plural pronoun? Now he changes to my. So there's something about his resisting a revelation, but not resisting taking action. So upon receiving that word, Mary says this: "His mother said to the servants, 'Whatever he says to you, do it.'" Got to say that is an amazing statement of the Christian faith and a great counsel just on the surface, these 7 words. Whatever he says to you, do it. Consider the power of that in light of the words of Jesus, the words of the Old or the New Testament. Whatever God says to you, do it. It's a simplicity of a statement with the complexity of the reality of what it means for us. But it's a strong statement. We don't know exactly who she said that to. We do know it's the servants. Later we'll see the head waiter speak up. So there's several attendants here. So even though I said we don't know who she said it to, we know it's said to a group. But the head waiter, in verse 9, is going to be more specific. And we're going to see Jesus offer some counsel. So we'll see a couple of things. I'm going to try to separate this out so it makes sense in our reading. So verse 6, there's some background here. And now we see that there's some utensils or some very large items that are present, and we see their purpose. Verse 6, there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification. I want to highlight this particular line. Throughout the Gospel of John, the number 6 is going to be strongly representative of what is natural or what is religious or what is a custom. And the next thing is what Jesus does or who he is. And that next thing is the 7th thing. The setting here is that the Jewish system, following the tenets of the law, the Jewish world in which this story takes place, this wedding, they were always purifying themselves with the use of water, whether it's a hand washing, a very disputable issue with Jesus' disciples versus those of the rabbis or John, bathing, which was a very common custom, all to the point of even the baptism. But evidently here, just in the washing of hands or other levels of purification. But these are going to be the centerpiece of the miracle that Jesus is going to perform in the sign of water into wine. We see the size and the scope of this, the impact that it'll have on the crowd. So I want to separate that out so that I can focus on the background story as you see with the word now. Jesus said to them, as I look at a pronoun here, Jesus said to them, evidently, it may speak to the same servants that his mother had mentioned earlier. So let's assume for a moment that the pronoun refers back antecedently to the servants. So Jesus said to the same people, in light of now this new information, fill the water pots with water. So now we see them respond. Very similar to what Jesus' mother had said, whatever he says to you, do it. They fulfill that. So they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the head waiter. So the servants, having dealt with Jesus almost as an aside, as just a person in the wedding with a clear social dilemma, they run out of wine, he's attending now to the problem. So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, did not know where it came from. But the servants who had drawn the water knew. The head waiter said to the bridegroom. Now, the change here is the head waiter evidently has a relationship to the bridegroom, and it appears that the bridegroom's responsibility was to supply wine for the guest. Unbeknownst to the head waiter, it wasn't the bridegroom in this story that provides the wine for the participants. It's Jesus. The significance of this is clear in light of what eventually we will know, that Jesus is the bridegroom for his bride, the church. But right now, we don't see Jesus as the bridegroom, and we don't see Jesus as a friend of the bridegroom, as was John the Baptist to Jesus. And we'll see this later in chapter 3. What we see here is that Jesus is simply a guest. It's a low-key, almost absent of any important notice. Jesus is simply someone in the crowd. So it's a low-key involvement, but he speaks to the people who will then take it to the leader, the head waiter, who's over the ceremony, who then takes it to the only participant that we see any mention of. We see no mention of the bride in this section. So here's the bridegroom receiving the news, and the surprise of the head waiter in verse 10. He said to him, that being the bridegroom, every man serves the good wine first. We see a practice here. And the good wine is to the person who first drinks a wine that the taste is appreciable. But if people continue to drink that good wine and drink freely, they lose a sense of taste, evidently. they drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. In other words, it's not as necessary to please the palate because people are inebriated or have lost their sense of taste. So why serve what is best at the end when the taste is not as sensitive? But this bridegroom gets credit for the good wine being later. Well, it's clearly not the bridegroom that has supplied it, it's Jesus. I'm going to separate out the conclusion that John offers in verse 11, this beginning of his signs, because this is a summary. He did it in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It's a fascinating reality to notice that John's statement that in this creation of a sign, the water into wine, was a manifestation of Jesus' glory. And through this sign, his disciples believed in him. I mentioned earlier, this is one of the more understated miracles or signs, which is a signifier of his identity, because it seems to meet the pleasurable expectations of people. Every man serves the good wine first, but you've kept the good wine until now. Jesus does not even get credit, according to the head waiter, for this event, because he attributes it to the bridegroom. But what's significant as we think through this section is the date, the third day, but in the narrative, in a larger sweep, it's actually the seventh day. Also significant, as I see it, are these reference to 6 stone pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification. But that is not sufficient for the need. It's what Jesus does with this set of 6 stone water pots filled to the brim that is the most significant thing. If I might draw a few observations, and I solicit and encourage your feedback, that John the Apostle has intentionally constructed his Gospel's opening stories to align with the creation of Genesis chapter 1 down into chapter 2, verse 3. The creation of Genesis is a natural creation from a sovereign God. What it appears to be here in Genesis modeling is that John's gospel is a spiritual creation, following the same patterns, the same words, the same structure of the first 18 verses. And now, in the 7th day, a day in which Jesus is evidently a guest at a party, a wedding, which is going to be a foretelling of another wedding that we will see in another one of John's books, the book of Revelation, when at the marriage feast, Jesus will come for his bride, the church. In a very short reference, the 7th day is not mentioned. I admit that clearly. But if we do the math of the previous 4 days and then add to it the 3rd day, I see a pattern of 4 and 3. This is very significant in light of the fact that most of Revelation is built around the same thing, a 4-3 day, or a 4, not 3 day, but a 4-3 day revelation in regards to the seals. So the 7th seal contains the next 7s, and then the 7th contains the next 7s. John's pattern is a 6-1 pattern. By the introduction here of the 3rd day, and this will be very significant, even at the end of chapter 2 of John's Gospel, the 3rd day, and this is now going to fly in some other information from other places, we know that Jesus was resurrected on the 3rd day. It's new life. He's born from the dead. We also know that wine is going to be symbolic of his blood. He who drinks of me, you take up the cup in the Last Supper, or the Lord's Supper in the upper room. Then this wine is foretelling of the work of Jesus' death. And it's going to be the wine and not the water that is going to bring about cleansing, purification. Because it's going to be the blood of Christ which purifies, not the water of Jewish custom or religion. It's going to be in an abundance, more than you can imagine. So the whole process here is to show that on the seventh day, the day that is divine, Jesus Christ, as a guest at a wedding, which is foretelling of him one day being the bridegroom, to come and receive his bride, he is providing his blessing to reveal his glory, or manifest his glory, that what was six and water and custom and purification in a religious sense has been eclipsed and been bypassed, because the grace of Jesus Christ is excelling. It excels. It's grace upon grace, as John said in the first overture of his gospel. Another note here in verse 10, according to the head waiter, that every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. This verse is really a contrast between the earthly pleasures or luxuries that people experience and those that are spiritual. The earthly model is that the good comes first, and then it becomes poorer throughout time. This earth, this world in which we live in, offers reward, or it offers fleshliness or materialness that is quick to satisfy, but it doesn't endure. What Jesus offers and what Jesus does is good, and it's the latter wine. It's better at the end. What a contrast those two offer. The conclusion of this section, John writes, the beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. He would do another one in the next couple of chapters. And he revealed himself, manifested. We see earlier that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. That's John chapter 1, verse 14. Now we see the idea that Jesus' sign manifested his glory. The six has been replaced by the one. The 6 stone pots, water pots of ceremonial washing has been replaced by his wine. And the result and response is his disciples believed in him. The note that follows, he went down in Capernaum and they all followed, and they stayed there a few days, prepares us for the next section, which we'll look at in the next video. But here at the end of chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, really concludes the opening section of John's Gospel, where we had an overture to consider in the first 18 verses, the first 4 days, John chapter 1, verse 19 through 51, and then now this climactic event, which is the seventh day, the Sabbath story, introducing us to the third day when Jesus would be raised from the dead. We'll see this again at the end of John chapter 2, and we see now the wine being introduced, and that wine being the sign that manifests his glory. The response to this is to know that Jesus Christ exceeds all of the Jewish tradition. He completes everything that had been in anticipation. He is excelling. He is the thing, though not explicitly mentioned, because the seventh day is never explicitly mentioned here. It's nevertheless something that we realize. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. And John makes it very clear that his disciples, having seen this sign, having beheld his glory, they believed. The pattern remains to any believer or any person that reads today the story of Jesus to know that he is grace excelling. His glory is manifested, and we believe.